As she too was on friendly terms with Standhartner, she at once entered into consultation with him as to how I could be helped out of the critical situation in which I was once more placed by the expenses of my concerts. She confessed to our mutual friend that she had no means at her disposal and would only be able to meet our extraordinary expenditure by contracting fresh debts. It was therefore necessary to secure wealthier patrons, among whom she mentioned Baroness von Stockhausen, the wife of the Hanoverian ambassador. This lady, who was a great friend of Standhartner's, was most kind to me and won me the sympathy of Lady Bloomfield and her husband, the English ambassador. A soirée was given in the house of the latter, and at Frau von Stockhausen's there were also several evening assemblies. One day Standhartner brought me 1,000 marks as an installment towards my expenses, saying that they came from an anonymous donor. Meanwhile, Madame Kalergis had managed to procure 2,000 marks, which were also placed at my disposal through Standhartner for further needs. But all her efforts to interest the court on my behalf remained entirely fruitless, in spite of her intimacy with Countess Zamoyska, for unfortunately a member of that Konrad's family from Saxony, which was everywhere turning up for my discomfiture, had now appeared as ambassador here also. He succeeded in suppressing any inclination the all-powerful Archduchess Sophie might have had towards me, by pretending that during his time I had burnt down the King of Saxony's castle. But my patroness, undaunted still, endeavored to help me in every conceivable way demanded by my necessities. In order to gratify my most earnest longing for a peaceful home where I could stay for a while, she managed to secure the house of the English attaché, a son of the famous Bulwer Lytton, who had been called away, but was keeping up his establishment for some time longer. Thus, through her I was introduced to this exceedingly amiable young man. I dined with him one evening, together with Cornelius and Madame Kalergis, and after dinner began to read them my Götterdämmerung. I did not seem to have secured a very attentive audience, however, and when I noticed this I stopped and withdrew with Cornelius. We found it very cold as we went home, and Bulwer's rooms seem also to have been insufficiently heated, so that we took refuge in a restaurant to drink a glass of hot punch. The incident has remained fixed in my memory because here for the first time I saw Cornelius in an ungovernably eccentric humor. While we thus took our pleasure, Kalergis used her influence so I was afterwards informed as an exceedingly powerful and irresistible female advocate to inspire Bulwer with a definite interest in my fate. In this she so far succeeded that he unconditionally placed his house at my disposal for 9 mouths. On considering the matter more deeply, however, I did not see what advantage this would be to me, seeing that I had no further prospect of earning any income in Vienna for my sustenance. On the other hand, my plans were decided for me by an offer which reached me from St. Petersburg to conduct 2 concerts there in the month of March for the Philharmonic Society for a fee of 2,000 silver rubles. For this also I had to thank Madame Kalergis, who urgently counseled me to accept the invitation, holding out at the same time a prospect of further increasing my receipts by giving an additional concert on my own account, from which very important material results might be expected. The only thing which could have induced me to decline this invitation would have been an assurance that my Tristan would be staged in Vienna during the next few months, but a fresh indisposition on the part of the tenor Ander had once more brought our preparations to a standstill, and moreover I had completely lost all faith in those promises which had lured me again to Vienna. To this the effect of my visit to the minister Schmerling immediately on my return to Vienna had certainly contributed. This man had been much astonished at my referring to a recommendation by Prince Metternich, for the latter, so the minister declared, had never spoken a word to him about me. Nevertheless, he very politely assured me that it needed no such recommendation to interest him in a man of my merit. When, therefore, I mentioned the idea suggested by Prince Metternich's kindness that the Emperor might assign me some special position in Vienna, he hastened at once to inform me that he was completely powerless to influence any of the Emperor's decisions. This admission on the part of von Schmerling certainly helped to explain Prince Metternich's behavior, and I concluded that the latter had preferred an attempt to win the chief chamberlain for a serious revival of Tristan to a fruitless effort with the minister. As these prospects were therefore thrust into the uncertain future, I now agreed to the St. Petersburg proposal, but first of all sought about for means to provide the necessary funds. For these I relied on a concert which Heinrich Porges had already arranged for me in Prague. Consequently, early in February I set out for that city, and had every reason to be satisfied with my reception there. Young Forges, an out-and-out partisan of Liszt and myself, pleased me greatly, not only personally, but by his obvious enthusiasm. The concert took place at the Hall on the Sophia Island and was crowned with great success. Besides one of Beethoven's symphonies, several selections from my newer works were given, and when next day Porges paid me about 2,000 marks, with the reservation of a few smaller supplementary payments, I laughingly assured him that this was the first money I had ever earned by my own exertions. He also gave me some very pleasant introductions to several exceedingly devoted and intelligent young people, belonging both to the German and Czech parties, and among them to a teacher of mathematics called Lieblein, and an author whose name was Musial. It was with a certain pathetic interest that, after so many years, I here discovered a friend of my earliest youth, named Marie Lowe, who had given up singing and taken to the harp instead, and was now engaged to play this instrument in the orchestra, in which capacity she assisted at my concert. On the occasion of the first performance of Tannhauser in Prague, she had sent me a most enthusiastic report about it. Her admiration was now intensified, and for many years afterwards she remained tenderly attached to me. Well satisfied then, and filled with newly awakened hope, I hurried back to Vienna again in order to put the arrangement for Tristan on as firm a basis as possible. It was found feasible to arrange another pianoforte rehearsal in my presence of the two first acts, and I was astonished at the really passable performance of the tenor, while from Frau Dustman I could not withhold my sincerest congratulations on her admirable execution of her difficult part. It was therefore decided that my work should be produced a little after Easter, which would fit in very well with the expected date of my return from Russia. The hope of being now able to count on earning a large income decided me to revive my former idea of settling for good in the peace and quiet of Biebrich. As there was still time before I had to start for Russia, I returned to the Rhine to arrange matters there as rapidly as possible. Once more I lodged in Frickofer's house, and in the company of Mathilde Meyer and her friend Louise Wagner, once more hunted through the Rheingau in search of a suitable house. Not finding what I wanted, I finally entered into treaty with Frickhofer for the erection of a small cottage on a plot of land I proposed to buy near his villa. Dr. Schuler, the man who had been introduced to me by young Stadel, was to take the matter in hand, as he had both legal and business experience. Estimates were prepared, and it now depended entirely on the amount of my Russian receipts as to whether the undertaking could be begun in the following spring or not. As in any case I had to give up my rooms in Frickhofer's house at Easter, I removed all my furniture and sent it packed to the furniture dealer in Wiesbaden, to whom I was still indebted for the greater part of it. Thus, in the best of spirits, I went first to Berlin, where I called at once on Bülow. Cosima, who was expecting an early confinement, seemed delighted to see me again, and insisted on accompanying me at once to the music school, where we should find Hans. I entered a long room, at one end of which Bülow was giving a music lesson. As I stood for some time in silence in the doorway, he gave an exclamation of anger at being disturbed, only to burst out into joyful laughter on recognizing who it was. Our midday meal together was lively, and in excellent humor I set out with Cosima alone for a drive in a fine carriage belonging to the Hotel de Russie, whose gray satin lining and cushions provided us with endless fun. Bülow seemed troubled that I should see his wife in a condition of advanced pregnancy, as I had once expressed my aversion from such a sight when speaking of another woman of our acquaintance. It put us into a good humor to be able to set his mind at rest in this case, for nothing could possibly put me out of sympathy with Cosima. So, sharing my hopes and heartily rejoicing in the turn of my fortune, these two friends accompanied me to the Königsberg railway station and saw me off on my long night journey. In Königsberg, I had to wait half a day and a night. As I had no desire to revisit my haunts in a place which had once been so fatal to me, I spent the time quietly in the room of an hotel, the position of which I did not even try to fix, and early in the morning continued my journey towards the Russian frontier. With certain uneasy memories of my former illegal passage of this frontier, I carefully scanned the faces of my fellow passengers during the long hours of travel. Among these I was especially struck by one, a Livland nobleman of German descent, who, in the haughtiest German Tory tone, proclaimed his disgust at the Tsar's emancipation of the serfs. He wished me clearly to understand that any efforts on the part of the Russians to obtain their freedom would receive but scant support from the German nobles settled in their midst. But as we approached St. Petersburg, I was genuinely frightened to find our train suddenly stopped and examined by the police. They were apparently searching for various persons suspected of complicity in the latest Polish insurrection, which had just broken out. Not far from the capital itself, the empty seats in our carriage were filled by several people, whose high Russian fur caps aroused my suspicions, which were not allayed by the attention which their wearers bestowed upon me in particular. But suddenly the face of one of them brightened up, and he impulsively turned towards me and saluted me as the man whom he and several other musicians of the Imperial Orchestra had come out on purpose to meet. They were all Germans, and on our arrival at the St. Petersburg Railway station, they joyfully introduced me to a further large contingent from the orchestra, headed by the committee of the Philharmonic Society. I had been recommended to a German boarding house on the New Sky Prospect as a suitable residence. There I was very graciously and flatteringly received by Frau Kunst, the wife of a German merchant, in a drawing room whose windows commanded a view of the wide and busy street, and where I was very well served. I dined in common with the other boarders and visitors, and often invited Alexander Serov, whom I had formerly known in Lucerne, to be my guest at table. He had called on me immediately on my arrival, and I learned that he held a very poor appointment as censor of German newspapers. His person bore signs of much neglect and ill health, and proved that he had had a hard struggle for existence, but he speedily won my respect by the great independence and truthfulness of his opinions, whereby, combined with an excellent understanding, I soon learned that he had won himself a reputation as a most influential and much dreaded critic. I appreciated this better later on when advances were made to me from high quarters to use my influence with Serov to assuage the bitterness of his persecution of Anton Rubinstein, who just at that time was being somewhat offensively patronized. On my mentioning the matter to him, he explained his reasons for believing Rubinstein's influence in Russia to be pernicious, whereupon I begged him, for my sake at least, to hold his hand a little, as I did not wish, during my brief stay in St. Petersburg, to pose as Rubinstein's rival. To this he replied with all the violence of a sickly man, "I hate him and cannot make any concessions." With me, on the contrary, he entered into the most intimate understanding, as he had so perfect an appreciation of me and my art that our intercourse became almost one of mere pleasantry, for on all serious points we were in entire agreement. Nothing could equal the care with which he sought to help me at every opportunity. He provided the necessary translation into Russian, both of the songs contained in the selections taken from my operas and of my explanatory program for the concerts. He also displayed the utmost judgment in choosing the most suitable singers for me, and for this he appeared to find abundant recompense in attending the rehearsals and performances. His radiant face beamed everywhere upon me with encouragement and fresh inspiration. I was eminently satisfied with the orchestra which I managed to gather around me in the large and handsome hall of the Society of Nobles. It contained 120 picked players from the imperial orchestras, who were for the most part excellent musicians, usually employed in accompanying Italian opera and ballets. They now seemed delighted to be allowed to breathe more freely and thus occupying themselves with nobler music under a method of conducting which I had made peculiarly my own. After the great success of my first concert, advances were made to me from those circles to which, as I could very well understand, I had been secretly but influentially recommended by Madame Calergis. With great circumspection, my unseen protectress had prepared the way for my presentation to the Grand Duchess Helene. I was instructed, in the first place, to make use of a recommendation from Standhartner to Dr. Arneth, the Grand Duchess's private physician, whom he had known in Vienna, in order through him to be introduced to Fräulein von Reden, her most confidential lady-in-waiting. I should have been well content with the acquaintance of this lady alone, for in her I learned to know a woman of wide culture, great intelligence, and noble bearing, whose ever-growing interest in me I perceived to be mingled with a certain timidity, apparently concerned chiefly with the Grand Duchess. She gave me the impression that she felt something more important ought to happen for me than, from the spirit and character of her mistress, she could expect. I was, however, not taken to pay my respects to the Grand Duchess at once, but received first of all an invitation to an evening party in the apartments of the lady-in-waiting, at which, among others, the Grand Duchess herself was to be present. Here Anton Rubinstein did the musical honors, and after the hostess had introduced me to him, she ventured to present me to the Grand Duchess herself. The ceremony went off fairly well, and, as a result, I shortly afterwards received a direct invitation to a friendly evening tea party at the Grand Duchess's house. Here, in addition to Fräulein von Reden, I met the lady next to her in rank, Fräulein von Stahl, as well as a genial old gentleman who was introduced to me as General von Brebern, for many years one of the Grand Duchess's closest friends. Fräulein von Reden appeared to have made extraordinary efforts on my behalf, which for the present resulted in the Grand Duchess expressing a wish that I should make her better acquainted with the text of my Nibelungen ring. As I had no copy of the work with me, although Weber of Leipzig ought by this time to have finished printing it, they insisted that I should at once telegraph to him in Leipzig to send the finished sheets with the utmost dispatch to the Grand Duchess's address. Meanwhile, my patrons had to be content with hearing me read the Meistersinger. To this reading the Grand Duchess Marie was also induced to come, a very stately and still beautiful daughter of the Tsar Nicholas, who was notorious for the passion she had shown throughout her life. As to the impression made upon this lady by my poem, Fräulein von Rayden only told me that she had been seriously alarmed lest Hans Sachs might end by marrying Eva. In the course of a few days, the loose proof sheets of my Nibelungen work duly arrived, and the Grand Duchess's intimates met at 4 tea parties to hear me read it, and listened with sympathetic attention. General von Brebern was present at them all, but only, as Fräulein von Rayden said, to blush like the rose, in profoundest slumber, a habit which always afforded a subject for merriment to Fräulein von Stahl, a very lively and beautiful woman, when each night I accompanied the 2 court ladies from the spacious salons along endless corridors and staircases to their distant apartments. The only other person in the great world whom I learned to know here was Count Wilohorsky, who occupied a high position of trust at the imperial court and was chiefly esteemed as a patron of music and considered himself a distinguished violoncello player. The old gentleman appeared well disposed towards me, and altogether satisfied with my musical performances. Indeed, he assured me that he had first learned to understand Beethoven's 8th Symphony in F major through my interpretation. He also considered that he had fully grasped my overture to the Meistersinger, and said the Grand Duchess Marie was affected because she had found this piece incomprehensible, but had expressed herself enraptured by the overture to Tristan, which he himself only managed to understand by the exertion of all his musical knowledge. When I told Seraph of this, he exclaimed enthusiastically, "Ah, that beast of a count. That woman knows what love is." The count arranged a splendid dinner in my honor, at which both Anton Rubinstein and Madame Abaza were present. As I begged Rubinstein to play something after dinner, Madame Abaza insisted on singing his Persian songs, which seemed greatly to annoy the composer, as he knew very well that he had produced much finer work. Nevertheless, both the composition and its execution gave me a very favorable opinion of the talents of both artists. Through this singer, who had originally had a professional engagement in the Grand Duchess's household, and was now married to a wealthy and cultured Russian gentleman of rank, I obtained an entry into the house of M. Abaza, who received me with great ceremony. About the same time, a certain Baron Wittinghoff had also made himself known to me as an enthusiastic lover of music, and honored me with an invitation to his house, where I met once more with Ingeborg Stark, the beautiful Swedish pianist and composer of sonatas, whom I had formerly known in Paris. She amazed me by the impertinent outburst of laughter with which she accompanied the performance of one of the Baron's compositions. On the other hand, she assumed a more serious air when she informed me that she was engaged to Hans von Bronsart. Rubinstein, with whom I exchanged friendly visits, behaved very creditably, although, as I had expected, he felt himself somewhat injured by me. He told me that he was thinking of resigning his position in St. Petersburg, as it had been made difficult by Seraph's antagonism. It was also thought advisable to introduce me to the commercial circles of St. Petersburg, with a view to my coming benefit concert, and a visit was consequently arranged to a concert in the hall of the Merchants' Guild. Here I was met on the staircase by a drunken Russian who announced himself as the conductor. With a small selection of imperial musicians and others, he conducted the overtures of Rossini's Tell and Weber's Oberon, in which the kettledrums were replaced by a small military drum, which produced a wonderful effect, especially in the lovely transfiguration part of the Oberon overture. Although I was admirably equipped for my own concerts as far as the orchestra was concerned, yet I had much trouble in procuring the requisite singers. The soprano was very passably represented by Emily Bianchi, but for the tenor parts one had to make shift with A.M. Sadoff, who, although possessing plenty of courage, had very little voice. But he managed to help me through the Schmied-Lieder in Siegfried, for his presence at least gave an appearance of song, while the orchestra alone undertook the effective reality. On the conclusion of my 2 concerts for the Philharmonic Society, I set seriously to work on my own concert, which was to be held in the Imperial Opera House, in the material arrangements for which I was helped by a retired musician. This man often spent hours with Seraph in my well-heated rooms without laying aside his enormous fur coat, and as his incapacity gave us a great deal of trouble, we agreed that he was like the sheep in wolf's clothing. The concert, however, succeeded beyond all my expectations, and I do not think I was ever so enthusiastically received by any audience as on this occasion. Indeed, their greeting when I first appeared was so loudly prolonged that I felt quite touched, a rare occurrence with me. To this wild abandonment on the part of the audience, the ardent devotion of my orchestra naturally contributed, as my 120 musicians renewed the frantic acclamations again and again, a procedure which appeared to be quite novel in St. Petersburg. From some of them I heard such exclamations as, "We must admit we have never known what music is till now." Conductor Schuberth, who, with a certain amount of condescension, had helped me with advice on business matters, now utilized this favorable turn of affairs to ask for my cooperation at a concert to be given shortly for his own benefit. Although I was fully aware that by this means he reckoned on conjuring a handsome profit out of my pocket into his own, yet on the advice of my friends I thought it best to comply with his request, albeit much against the grain. So a week later I repeated the most popular items of my program before an equally numerous audience, and with the same success, but this time the handsome receipts of 3,000 rubles were destined for an invalid man, who as a retribution for this encroachment on my rights was suddenly summoned to another world in the same year. To balance this, I now had a prospect of further artistic and material successes from a contract concluded with General Lwoff, the manager of the Moscow Theater. I was to give 3 concerts in the Grand Theater, of which I was to have half the receipts, guaranteed in each case at a minimum of 1,000 rubles. I arrived there suffering from a cold, miserable and ill at ease, in weather which was a mixture of frost and thaw, and put up at a badly situated German boarding house. My preliminary arrangements were made with the manager, who, in spite of the orders hanging from his neck, looked a very insignificant person, and the difficult selection of the vocal items had to be arranged with a Russian tenor and a superannuated Italian lady singer. Having settled these, I entered upon the task of orchestral rehearsals. It was here that I first met the younger Rubinstein, Anton's brother Nicholas, who, as director of the Russian Musical Society, was the leading authority in his profession in Moscow. His demeanor towards me was characterized throughout by modesty and consideration. The orchestra consisted of the 100 musicians who provided the imperial household with Italian opera and ballet. It was, on the whole, far inferior to that of St. Petersburg, yet among them I found a small number of excellent quartet players, all devotedly attached to me. Among these was one of my old Riga acquaintances, the cellist von Lutzow, who in those days had a great reputation as a wag. But I was particularly pleased with a certain Herr Albrecht, a violinist, a brother of the Albrecht who was one of the party whose Russian for caps had so scared me on my way to St. Petersburg. But even these men could not dispel my feeling that in dealing with this Moscow orchestra I had descended in the artistic scale. I gave myself a great deal of trouble without deriving any compensating satisfaction, and my bile was not a little stirred by the Russian tenor, who came to rehearsal in a red shirt, to show his patriotic aversion from my music, and sang the Schmied Lieder of Siegfried in the insipid style acquired from the Italians. On the very morning of the first concert, I was obliged to cancel it and declare myself on the sick list with a bad, feverish cold. In the slush and snow which inundated the streets of Moscow, it seems to have been impossible to announce this fact to the public, and I heard that angry disturbances resulted when many splendid equipages arrived on a fruitless errand and had to be turned away. After 3 days' rest, I insisted on giving the 3 concerts I had contracted for. Within 6 days, an exertion to which I was spurred by a desire to have done with an undertaking I felt was not worthy of me. Although the Grand Theatre was filled on each occasion with a brilliant audience, such as I had never before seen, yet, according to the calculations of the imperial manager, the receipts did not exceed the amount of the guarantee. With this, however, I was content, considering the magnificent reception accorded to my efforts, and above all the fervid enthusiasm of the orchestra, which was expressed here as it had been in St. Petersburg. A deputation of members of the orchestra begged me to give a 4th concert, and on my refusal, they tried to persuade me to remain for another rehearsal, but this too I was compelled to decline with a smile. However, the orchestra honored me with a banquet, at which, after N. Rubinstein had made a very enthusiastic and appropriate speech, which was greeted with hearty and tumultuous applause. One of the company hoisted me on to his shoulders and carried me round the hall, whereupon there was a great outcry, and everyone wanted to render me the same kindly service. I was presented on this occasion with a gold snuff box from the members of the orchestra, on which was engraved the words Doc Ainukam from Siegmund's song in the Walkyer. I returned the compliment by presenting to the orchestra a large photograph of myself, on which I wrote the words Keener Jing from the same song. In addition to these musical circles, I also became acquainted with Prince Odoyski as the result of an introduction and strong recommendation by Madame Kalergis. She had told me that in the prince I should meet one of the noblest of men, who would fully understand me. After a most arduous drive of many hours, I reached his modest dwelling and was received with patriarchal simplicity at his family midday dinner, but I found it exceedingly difficult to convey to him any particulars as to myself and my plans. With regard to any impressions I might be expected to gather respecting himself, he seemed to rely on the effect produced by the contemplation of a large instrument resembling an organ, which he had designed and erected in one of his principal rooms. Unluckily, there was no one there who could play it, but I could not help thinking it must have been intended for some specially devised form of divine worship, which he held there on Sundays for the benefit of his household, relatives, and acquaintances. Ever mindful of my kindly patroness, I attempted to give the genial prince some idea of my position and my aspirations. With apparent emotion, he exclaimed, "Je sais chuil vous faut, parles a wolfson." On further inquiry, I learned that the guardian spirit thus commended to me was not a banker, but a Russian Jew who wrote romances. All these events seemed to justify the conclusion that my receipts, especially if I included what I might still derive from St. Petersburg, would amply suffice to carry out my project of building a house at Biebrich. I therefore sent a telegram about it to my authorized agent in Wiesbaden from Moscow and left there after a stay of only 10 days. I also forwarded 1,000 rubles to Minna, who was complaining that her expenses for settling down in Dresden were very heavy. But, unfortunately, on reaching St. Petersburg, I met with serious disappointments. Everyone advised me to relinquish the idea of giving my second concert on Easter Monday, the date I had fixed, as it was the general custom in Russian society to reserve that day for private gatherings. On the other hand, I could not well refuse to give a concert on the third day after the date announced for my own, on behalf of those imprisoned for debt in St. Petersburg, seeing that this was to be given at the urgent request of the Grand Duchess Helene herself. In this latter function, all St. Petersburg was already interested for the sake of their own credit, as it was under the most distinguished patronage, so that, while every seat was sold in advance for this function, I had to be content with a very empty house at the Nobles' Casino, and with proceeds which luckily did at least cover expenses. By way of contrast, the debtors' concert went off with the greatest success, and General Suvorov, the governor of the city, a strikingly handsome man, handed me a very beautifully wrought silver drinking horn as a thank offering from the imprisoned debtors. I now set about paying my farewell calls, one of which was on Fräulein von Reden, who distinguished herself by the warmth of her sympathy and interest. By way of compensating me for the loss of the receipts I had reckoned upon, the Grand Duchess sent me through this lady the sum of 1,000 rubles, coupled with a promise that, until my circumstances improved, she would repeat the gift annually. On discovering this friendly interest, I could not help regretting that the connection thus formed was not likely to have more stable and profitable results. I addressed a petition through Fräulein von Reden to the Grand Duchess, praying that she would permit me to come to St. Petersburg for a few months every year to place my talents at her disposal, both for concerts and theatrical performances, in return for which she would only have to pay me a suitable yearly salary. To this I received an evasive reply. On the day before my departure, I informed my amiable guardian of my plan for settling at Biebrich, and in doing so, I made no secret of my fear that after spending the money I had earned here in carrying out my building plan, my condition might be very much the same as of yore, a fear which made me wonder whether it would not be better to abandon it altogether. Whereupon I received the spirited reply, "Build and hope." At the last moment before starting, I gratefully answered her in the same manner and said that I now knew what to do. Thus at the end of April I departed, carrying with me the hearty good wishes of Seraph and the enthusiastic members of the orchestra, and steamed away across the Russian wilderness without calling at Riga, where I had been invited to give a concert. The long and weary road brought me at last to the frontier station of Werballen, where I received a telegram from Fräulein von Reden, not too rash. This was in reference to a few lines I had left behind for her, and it conveyed quite enough to revive my doubts as to the wisdom of carrying out my house-building plans. I reached Berlin without further delay and at once made for Bülow's house. During the last few months I had heard no news of Cosima's condition, and it was, therefore, with some trepidation that I stood at the door, through which the maid did not seem disposed to let me pass, saying that her mistress was not well. "Is she seriously ill?" I asked, and receiving a smilingly evasive reply, at once realized to my joy the true situation, and hastened in to greet Cosima. She had been some time delivered of her daughter Blondine, and was now on the highroad to complete recovery. It was only from casual callers that she remained secluded. Everything seemed well, and Hans was quite gay, the more so that he now thought me freed from all care for some time to come, owing to the success of my Russian trip. But I could not regard this assumption as justified, unless my wish to be invited for some months every year to St. Petersburg for renewed activity there met with a ready response. On this point I was enlightened in a more detailed letter from Fräulein von Reden following the above telegram, in which she told me on no account to rely upon this invitation. This distinct statement compelled me to reckon up the balance of my Russian receipts very seriously, and after deducting hotel and traveling expenses, the money sent to Minna and certain payments to the furniture dealer at Wiesbaden, I found I had very little more than 12,000 marks left. So the scheme of buying land and building a house had to be relinquished. But Cosima's excellent health and high spirits dispelled all anxious thought for the present. We drove out again in a splendid carriage, and in the most extravagant of good humors, through the avenues of the Tiergarten, dined to our heart's content at the Hotel de Russie, and made up our minds that bad times had fled forever. For the immediate present my plans were directed towards Vienna. I had recently heard that Tristan had once more been abandoned, this time owing to the indisposition of Frau Dustman. In order to have this important matter more directly under my own supervision, and also because I had formed no such intimate artistic ties with any other German city as with Vienna, I clung to this as the most suitable place in which to settle. Tausig, whom I now met there in excellent health and spirits, entirely confirmed me in this opinion, and still further strengthened it by undertaking to find me precisely the pleasant and quiet dwelling in the neighborhood of Vienna that I had set my mind upon, and through his own landlord he succeeded in getting something exactly to my taste. In what had been the pleasant abode of old Baron von Rakowitz at Penzing, I was offered the most delightful accommodation for a yearly rent of 2,400 marks. I could have the entire upper part of the house and the exclusive use of a shady and fairly large garden. In the housekeeper, Franz Mrazek, I found a very obliging man, whom I at once took into my service, together with his wife Anna, an exceedingly gifted and obliging woman. For many years, amid ever-changing fortunes, this couple remained faithful to me. I now had to begin spending money in order to make my long-desired asylum fit and cozy both for rest and work. The remnant of my household belongings, including any Erard Grand, was sent on from Biebrich, as well as the new furniture I had found it necessary to buy. On the 12th of May, in lovely spring weather, I took possession of my pleasant home, and for a while wasted much time over the exciting cares connected with the fitting up of my comfortable apartments. It was at this period that my connection with Philip Haas and Sons was first established, which was destined with the lapse of time to give me some cause for anxiety. For the moment, every exertion expended on a domicile associated with so many hopes only helped to put me into the best of spirits. The grand piano arrived in due course, and with the addition of various engravings after Raphael, which had fallen to my lot in the Biebrich division, my music room was completely furnished in readiness for the 22nd of May, when celebrated my 50th birthday. In honor of the occasion, the Merchants' Choral Society gave me an evening serenade with Chinese lantern illuminations, in which a deputation of students also joined and greeted me with an enthusiastic oration. I had laid in a supply of wine, and everything passed off excellently. The Mrzika looked after my housekeeping fairly well, and thanks to the culinary arts of Anna, I was able to invite Tausig and Cornelius to dine with me pretty frequently. But I was soon in great trouble again on account of Minna, who bitterly reproached me for everything I did. Having made up my mind never to answer her again, I wrote this time to her daughter Natalie, who was still in ignorance of the relationship between them, referring her to my decision of the previous year. On the other hand, the fact that I sadly stood in need just now of some womanly attentions and care in the management of the household became abundantly clear to me when I expressed to Mathilde Meyer of Mayence the ingenuous wish that she would come and supply the deficiency. I had certainly thought that my good friend was sensible enough to interpret my meaning correctly without feeling put to the blush, and I was very likely right, but I had not made sufficient allowance for her mother and her bourgeois surroundings generally. She appears to have been thrown into the greatest excitement by my proposal, while her friend Louise Wagner was in the end so powerfully influenced that she frankly advised me, with homely shrewdness and precision, to obtain a legal separation from my wife first of all, after which everything else would be easily arranged. Grievously shocked, I at once withdrew my offer, as having been made without due deliberation, and strove as far as possible to allay the excitement thus produced. On the other hand, Friedrich Meyer's inexplicable fate still caused me much involuntary anxiety. After she had spent several months of the previous winter in Venice, apparently to her benefit, I had written to her from St. Petersburg suggesting that she should meet me at the Bülow's in Berlin. I had taken into mature consideration the kindly interest which Cosima had conceived for her, with a view to discussing what steps we could take to bring order into our friend's flagrantly disorganized circumstances. She did not appear, however, but wrote instead to inform me that she had taken up her abode with a lady friend at Coburg, as her very delicate state of health seriously interfered with her theatrical career, and was endeavoring to maintain herself by occasional appearances at the small theater there. It was obvious that for many reasons I could not send her an invitation, such as that sent to Mathilde Meyer, though she expressed a violent desire to see me once more for a short time, assuring me that afterwards she would forever leave me in peace. I could only regard it as purposeless and risky to accede to this wish just then, though I kept the idea in reserve for the future. During the course of the summer, she repeated the same request from several places, until, as I was engaged late in the autumn for a concert at Karlsruhe, I at last appointed that time and place for the desired meeting. From that time forth, I never received the slightest communication from this most singular and attractive friend of mine, and as, moreover, I did not know where she was, I looked upon our connection as severed. Not until many years later was the secret of her position, certainly a very difficult one, revealed to me, and from the facts then stated I could only conclude that she shrank from telling me the truth concerning her connection with Jovan Guaida. It appeared that this man had much more serious claims upon her than I had suspected, and she had apparently been compelled by the necessities of her situation to accept his protection, as he was the only friend left to her, while his devotion was undeniably genuine. I heard that she was then living in complete retirement both from the stage and from society on a tiny estate on the Rhine with her 2 children, being, it was believed, secretly married to Havon Guaida. But my careful and elaborate preparations for a quiet spell of work had not yet been successful. A burglary in the house, which robbed me of the golden snuff box presented by the Moscow musicians, renewed my old longing to have a dog. My kind old landlord consequently handed over to me an old and somewhat neglected hound named Pole, one of the most affectionate and excellent animals that ever attached itself to me. In his company I daily undertook long excursions on foot, for which the very pleasant neighborhood afforded admirable opportunities. Nevertheless, I was still rather lonely, as Tausig was confined to bed for a long time by severe illness, while Cornelius was suffering from an injured foot, the result of a careless descent from an omnibus when visiting Penzing. Meanwhile, I was in constant friendly intercourse with Standhartner and his family. Fritz, the younger brother of Heinrich Porges, had also begun to visit me. He was a doctor who had just set up practice, a really nice fellow whose acquaintance with me dated from the serenade of the Merchants' Glee Club, of which he had been the originator.